Welcome back, guys. Now let's take a look at adaptive evolution. So, natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution. So, remember, adaptive evolution is evolution and change in a species to better fit the environment. Natural selection is the only one that consistently causes that. Okay. Now, evolution by natural selection does involve both chance and some sorting. The chance arises in new variations arising, from chance mutations or chance recombinations, new combinations of genes or alleles. Um, and then you have the predictable part, which is beneficial alleles are sorted by natural selection. Nature selects who's more likely to survive and reproduce. Like I said before, that is the only way to get. So natural selection consistently increases the frequencies of alleles that provide reproductive advantage. So if you've got an advantage in getting your genes to the next generation, that's what natural selection is going to select for. So that means you got to survive long enough to do it, and you got to be able to get the mate. Just a reminder that natural selection brings about adaptive evolution by taking an organism's phenotype. Generally speaking, it doesn't care what your genotype is, it's just your phenotype. That's what is seen, quote unquote, by nature and selected. Are you able to digest milk or not? Are you able to outrun the bear or not? Okay. So that brings up the case of relative fitness. And a lot of times the phrase struggle for existence and survival of the fittest makes people think that you survive because you're in direct competition with another member of your species for survival. So there's competition among individuals. That is not generally the case. It's usually more subtle than that. Um, you're all out there trying to, find food in the field. If you're just a little bit better at finding food, you get it. You're not trying to beat out the other guy necessarily, but you are. You're getting more food. You're a little healthier. You have more kids. Okay. So relative fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation, relative to the contributions of other individuals. So if you're contributing, 51% of the gene pool to the next generation, and the other guy's contributing 49%, you're both pretty equal, right? But the 51% is just a little more fit. Their relative fitness is a little higher. Okay, so that selection favors genotypes by acting on the phenotypes of those individuals. There are three modes of selection. We've mostly been talking about directional selection so far, which favors individuals at one extreme end of the phenotypic range. So, the faster ones to get away from the bear, and you get faster and faster and faster, right? That's directional selection. Disruptive selection favors individuals at both extremes. So it favors the really fast ones and the really slow ones, but the medium speed ones don't do well. Okay. And that would, I got the word divergent here, that's going to tend to push the population further apart, and maybe the basis could become the basis for a divergent evolution or a speciation event eventually. And then there's stabilizing selection, which favors the middle road. Okay, knocks off the high points, the ones at the extreme ends, the really fast or the really slow, and the medium speed ones win, for instance. And that would all depend on the particular environment you're living in. So some pictorial examples here. So here we got kind of our original population of mice with different fur colors. Think back to the rock pocket mice a little bit. So here's the normal distribution. We got a lot in the middle, the really dark, the really light. In directional selection, let's see, these mice were in a area that they got darker color. You're going to kill off, the predators are probably more likely to kill off the lighter colored ones because they're easier to see against the dark rock, and the darker colored ones are more likely to live. So you shift the whole population's phenotype to the right here, and then we've got an evolved population. Here we've got disruptive selection. Let's say these mice were in a place where it was really patchy. There were some really light areas and some really dark areas. Okay, so what happens there is the ones that are kind of in the middle on the color, they're more likely to get knocked off because they can't hide anywhere. They stick out like a sore thumb in the light areas. They stick out like a sore thumb in the dark areas. Whereas the light mice, yeah, they stick out like a sore thumb in the dark areas, but they can quickly get to a light area and hide. And the same is true here. The dark ones can quickly get to a dark area and hide. So they are able to hide where the ones in the middle can't, for instance. And that's going to potentially lead to a divergent evolution situation where, the light colored mice are going to be hanging out in the light areas more, which means they're more likely to mate with other light colored mice. Same thing's going for the dark colored mice. So eventually they might start drifting apart even more genetically. And then lastly, we have stabilizing selection, where we kind of knock off the extremes and we kind of narrow down the diversity within the population. And that keeps you like, this is the one that does best. We don't need these other ones. At this time anyway. If environment changes, you might regret having stabilizing selection, but in a stable environment, you can see that happening quite often. So let's make some connections. Okay. Natural selection increases the frequency or the proportion of the alleles that tend to enhance survival and reproduction in that environment. That adaptive evolution then occurs as the match between a species and its environment increases. So if you have natural selection going, the species will get better and better adapted to its environment over time. That being said, because the environment can and does change, adaptive evolution is a continuous process. You never get to the end. Just as you're starting to get better adapted to the environment changes a little bit more, and you got to keep adapting. And then back to how genetic drift and gene flow interact here. Genetic drift and gene flow do not consistently lead to adaptive evolution. Sometimes they can. Sometimes you can get lucky, and gene flow can bring in beneficial genes. And sometimes you can get unlucky, and it can bring in negative genes. We saw that in the last set of notes. Same thing with genetic drift. Sometimes you get lucky, and the ones that happen, to survive, the random munching of a cow on those flowers were the ones that were best suited for other reasons too. And so that might help the population. But on the other hand, it could just as easily hurt it. Genetic drift and gene flow do not really have much directionality. You're not going towards improved fit to the environment necessarily. Whereas natural selection, generally you do. All right, some little notes and some questions about genetic variation. The reduction of genetic variation within a given population can increase the difference between populations of the same species. So how could reducing the variation in one population increase the differences between this one that was getting reduced variation and another population of the same species? Yeah, their genes aren't the same. They're less like the same population. They're getting more and more different, and that could lead eventually to some speciation. Okay. Mutations result in genetic variation, given, which provides phenotypes on which natural selection acts. Can you support that statement? Pause the video, go back through our thoughts on how genetics works and how that relates to evolution. And can you support or back up or justify that statement that mutations result in genetic variation, which then provides phenotypes on which natural selection acts? Yeah, the only way to get new alleles is through mutation. And without mutation, natural selection doesn't have anything to work with. If everybody's exactly the same, there's no advantage to one or the other, and who lives and dies is just random chance. So you need both. Lastly, small populations are more susceptible to random environmental impact than large populations. Small are more likely to be impacted by some random environmental impact than large populations. Can you justify that? There's a couple of things here, right? A small population's more likely to get completely wiped out just by random chance. Whereas a large population, just by the sheer numbers, more likely you're going to have more survive. And you're going to have more genetic variation in those that survive too, most likely. Where in a small population, you could drastically reduce the genetic variation of the population very quickly with environmental change. And that could wipe out the population or kind of bake in some negative alleles and negative phenotypes. All right. Pause your video here. Go do this scientific skills exercise on page 487. It'll help kind of reinforce some of this stuff. And then meet me back here. All right. This next section, I may or may not go over this in class. I'm going to put it in the video. I am not super confident this is going to be on the AP exam. In fact, I'm leaning more towards it won't be, uh, but I'm not sure yet. So I'm going to include this just in case. It's just interesting stuff either way. So not a bad thing to look at. So sexual selection is natural selection, but for mating success. So far, most of the time we've been talking about natural selection in terms of um, survival, right? But fitness includes both survival and passing on your genes. And for passing on your genes, you need to be able to attract a mate. You need to have a mate. Okay. So you can see that in, say, peacocks here, right? These big showy feathers on the peacock, the male peacock, help to attract the female. Okay. Um, Now, this can result in sexual dimorphism, a marked difference between the sexes in secondary sexual characteristics. So here, the peahen doesn't want to be flashy because that's going to attract predators, and she's got to sit still on a nest for long periods of time. So for her to survive, especially when she's nesting, she's got to be well camouflaged. The male peacock, on the other hand, doesn't have to sit still, so it can afford to be a little bit more flashy. Um, it's still a survival detriment to be like this with these giant feathers and colors, because obviously it takes energy to make these giant feathers. It takes energy to make these vibrant colors. It takes more energy to run around with all these giant feathers. It's more likely to be visible to predators. Um, so it's a survival detriment, okay, pretty clearly, but it is a reproductive help. Um, if a male peacock can do all this, have all these colors, and use all that energy, and still be around, the female looks at him and say, "Hey, you know how to get nutrients, and you know how to survive. You're fast. You're good. So I want to have babies with you." So my babies are like that, and that's kind of why this happens. Okay. Couple different types of sexual selection. There's intra-sexual selection. That's like, the two bucks fighting it out to control the females in a herd, right? So direct competition within a species, the same sex in the species. Intersexual selection is what I was talking about with the peacocks. That's often called mate choice. When it occurs when individuals of one sex, which is usually, but not always, the females, are choosing and selecting their mates. They want to get the mate who's got the best genes to give to their kids. So male showiness due to mate choice can increase a male's chance of attracting a female while decreasing his chance of survival. We talked about that. And I kind of jumped the gun before, but how do females' preferences evolve? They likely evolve because males who can get the energy and survive and stuff, even with these showiness, so they can attract the attention of the female, yet they're still alive, they probably got some other good stuff going on. That brings us to balancing selection. Okay. We talked about those prairie chickens. We talked about we want good allele diversity in a population increases the chances of survival of the population in the long term, which means you don't want to get rid of all the alleles sometimes. Now, bad alleles you want to get rid of, but sometimes you want some variation in those alleles. So you got choices in the future if the environment changes, right? You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. Diploidy, the fact that we've got, you can be heterozygous, right? Capital H, little h, means that those recessive alleles, you can be a carrier for them, like with a lot of genetic diseases, but also a carrier for things that aren't necessarily, awesome in a particular environment, but you can carry them and you can keep those alleles in your gene pool for a long period of time if they're hidden, because they don't affect what's going on in the selection, because they don't wind up affecting the phenotype. Even though they're in the genotype, they don't affect it. Okay. So that's when balancing selection occurs, when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms in a population. And what I was just mentioning was something called heterozygote advantage, where the heterozygotes have a higher fitness than the homozygotes, where you want to retain two or more alleles at a locus. Example of that would be, we talked about it before, sickle cell, right? Two normal wild type alleles, and you're going to produce normal red blood cells. One of your alleles being the sickle allele on your DNA, you will produce cells that will, in a low oxygen environment, sickle like this and clog up the capillaries. Um, but it doesn't happen as severely as if you have two of those alleles. Two of those alleles, the sickling is going to happen often, and it's not good for you. This in-between state where you've got a dominant and recessive, a normal and a sickling allele, it seems to provide some protection against the worst symptoms of malaria. That sickling of the cells seems to allow the body to kill the malaria parasite more easily. Not sure exactly how that is, but if you have that heterozygote condition, you're actually more fit in areas where there's a lot of malaria, because you're more likely to live long enough to reproduce than if you had the full sickling. You're going to die, because of that, probably too young to reproduce, or not be able to find a mate. Or if you have the full normal, where you never sickle, you're more likely to die of malaria before you're old enough to mate. So that in between is advantageous in that particular situation. Okay. Quick question for you here. In a region free of malaria, would individuals who are heterozygous for the sickle cell trait allele be selected for or selected against? Bit of a trick question, isn't it? So in an area free of malaria, there's no advantage to having that sickle cell trait being heterozygous for it, right? However, if having it doesn't significantly negatively affect you and keep you from being able to survive long enough to reproduce and find a mate, it's probably going to stick around. Okay. It's not going to grow in population. It'll probably shrink extremely slowly over time. But it's not going to provide much of a disadvantage. It doesn't provide any advantage, so it's not going to grow. But it doesn't provide any major disadvantage usually, especially in our modern age, so it's going to stick around. The other one I want to talk about is frequency-dependent selection. In frequency-dependent selection, the fitness of a phenotype declines if it becomes too common. So if too many people have blue eyes, it becomes less fit, for instance. It's too common. Oh, blue eyes, that's so, I don't want to date somebody with blue eyes. It's really not what we're talking about here, but we're kind of on the same thing. The interesting one here is this type of fish that feeds on the scales on the side of other fish. Now you see some of them have the mouth on the right side of their head and some of them on the left side. That means these guys can feed over here, but they can't feed on this side, and vice versa. Okay, so if we have if we got a lot of these right mouth ones, let's say, or left mouth ones, let's say, here, these guys, they're feeding on this side a bunch, and if there's too many of them, this side of all their prey fish loses all their scales and don't have food. So the ones who are going to produce more in the next generation are the ones down here who are in a smaller frequency in the population because there's more food available to them. So in the next generation, there's going to be more of these and fewer of those. And you're going to kind of fluctuate up and down between left and right mouth being more dominant, not more dominant, more prevalent, generation to generation. Okay, so you can keep both of those phenotypes. They're both useful, but you don't want to have too many of one or too few of the other, and it kind of goes back and forth and oscillates and keep everything balanced. All right, last part on this section of notes, guys, the 712, variations in populations. The level of variation in a population can be quite different. Some populations can have a huge amount of genetic and phenotypic variation within them, right? So you have lots of individuals with unique or different variations. On the other hand, like in purebred dogs, other populations have very little variation in them, okay? Like in these Great Danes or these little Chihuahuas. Both of those conditions can have a major impact on the overall health and survival of population, whether it's a lot of variation or very little variation. Let me pose some questions and just have you think about it. Question: which type of population, large variation or small variation, is less able to respond to changes in the environment? Why? Population's ability to respond to a change is influenced by genetic diversity. Species and populations with little genetic diversity are at risk of decline or extinction. So yeah, less variation, you're more likely to go extinct than if you have more variation within your population. Why? Yeah, because you have less tools to work with when the environment changes. If you got just a very narrow set of alleles, you don't have much room to go one way or the other. You got two things: your light brown and your little bit lighter brown. If the environment changes color too much, neither of those are going to work. You're more likely to go extinct. Whereas if you got a population where there's a lot more, like there's really light to light brown to dark brown to dark brown, no matter what happens to the color of the population, you're more likely to have some individuals who will be able to survive in that changing environment. So more variation is going to allow you a better chance at surviving environmental change. I just answered this question, sorry. If an allele or set of alleles is good for a population in its current habitat, will that always be the case? No, because the environment changes. Okay, or if you go somewhere else, it's not going to be the best set of alleles. Okay, it's the best set of alleles in that time, in that place. So building off of that, natural selection cannot fashion the perfect organism. A number of reasons why. One, it can only act on existing variations. You've got to deal with what's in the genes. Okay? You pick the best of what's available. You don't get to design the perfect new gene. Ooh, wouldn't it be great if we could evolve wings and fly around? Yes, that'd be amazing. Let's put some wings right back here. Doesn't work that way. Okay, you can't do that in nature, at least. And evolution is limited by historical constraints. So if growing wings was beneficial, you ever wonder why a lot of the like birds and bats have 2 legs and wings as opposed to 4 legs and wings? It's because their ancestors had 4 legs. They were 4-legged, crawling around the ground critters. And rather than trying to grow a whole extra set of limbs with muscles and attachment points and everything else to get wings on top of the 4 legs, what evolution does is by slight changes to a pair of the arms or legs, it can turn them into wings. It has to work with what's available, what's there, which is the front 2 legs. Okay, it can't spontaneously grow more that happen to be good wings. Okay, adaptations are often compromises. They're the best we got for a given situation. They're not perfect because of the other things above. And then you also got chance, okay, playing a role, and environmental changes playing a role, and you're just never going to get there. Okay. So at this point, guys, please go ahead and do the topic questions for 712, and then I will see you on the next set of notes. Bye.